It all started with a series of YouTube videos and images showing for the first time Cuban recruits in Russia. They revealed they had been recruited and given air tickets to travel from Cuba to Russia, reportedly to do construction work in war-affected areas. But soon after they arrived in Russia, they found out they were going to be sent as soldiers to the front line of the war with Ukraine. They said they had been deceived with promises of a better life that were not true.
Any Cuban who thinks about coming here, don't come. Don't even think about it. This is a scam.
On September 5th, the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Relations, Bruno Rodriguez, issued a statement saying it had detected a Russia-based human trafficking network that was recruiting Cubans to be sent to the war in Ukraine.
Cuba's enemies promote distorted information that seeks to tarnish the country's image and present it as an accomplice in these actions, which we categorically reject.
Cubans also said they dismantled the alleged human trafficking network that was doing the recruiting, and also announced that 17 individuals involved were arrested. But few were willing to buy the regime's narrative.
They got caught once again. This is just the latest in a long series of criminal enterprises run by the Cuban government, and anytime they've gotten caught historically, their first act is to deny it and then imprison some individuals as proof that they had no knowledge.
According to Chris Simmons, a former counterintelligence agent with the Defense Intelligence Agency and an expert on Cuban affairs, there's no way the Cuban regime hasn't been involved in the recruiting of young Cuban to be sent to Russia.
The idea that someone could be running a mercenary ring without the government's knowledge is ludicrous. It's absolutely impossible for major criminal enterprises to exist without the Cuban government's knowledge and involvement.
Juan Antonio Blanco, a former high-ranking Cuban intelligence officer and diplomat who defected to the U.S., agrees with Simmons.
It is absolutely impossible to believe the Cuban government when they claim that they had no relationship with a network that was recruiting Cubans to be sent to the war in Ukraine.
The former Cuban diplomat thinks Havana is using the whole controversy as a smokescreen to hide Raul Castro's real intentions to send regular Cuban troops to the war theater in Ukraine.
This is a straw man to divert the real purpose, which is sending regular troops to Ukraine.
Blanco said that Cuban military personnel are already training in an area close to the Ukraine border in Belarus, following a cooperation agreement signed by Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel and Lukashenko. In fact, Havana are now changing their narrative. Cuban ambassador to Moscow Julio Antonio Garmendia said recently that they have nothing against Cubans signing contracts and joining the Russian army to fight in Ukraine. Counterintelligence specialist Simmons said Cuba has a particular interest taking financial advantage of Russia's war against Ukraine.
They absolutely do need Russia. The Cuban economy remains devastated, and the Russians have been their biggest and most generous supporter.
According to National Defense University professor Hugo Atcha, Havana is sending Cubans to Russia to get as much money as possible.
You now are seeing a regime profiteering from sending people in harm's way.
Professor Atcha said Cuba is just repeating the same pattern of human trafficking it has followed in the past.
Right now, we are seeing young Cubans being sent to fight in the war of aggression against Ukraine and generating revenue to the Cuban regime. At the same time that the so-called Cuban medical missions, as the shipyard builders, as the entertainers in the cruise industry, as the workers in the hotels that are established within Cuban territory.
The academic said Cuba is even profiting from the insurance policy contract every recruit has to sign once in Russia. According to this document, Russians fighting in Ukraine can get as much as $80,000, including almost $50,000 in insurance payments. But experts think that although mercenaries or foreign soldiers like Cubans probably won't get as much, Cuba is going to heavily charge rations for troops they're going to send to Ukraine.
It's not going to be a free ride for the Russians. The Cubans are going to charge them, if not overcharge them, given their weak situation, economically speaking, for sending these troops and carrying out these operations in the battlefield.
Blanco said that Cuba has the operational capacity of sending thousands of Cuban soldiers to Russian territory through the dozens of flights that bring in Russian tourists to locations as Varadero, Cayo Coco, and Havana.
They are involved in this war because they need resources, they need the alliance with Russia, and they want to cement that alliance with blood, providing these soldiers and these troops.
Cuba has a long history of intervention in international war conflicts in the past. For decades, Fidel Castro sent up to 400,000 soldiers and officials to 14 African countries during a period of 16 years between 1975 and 1991. In Latin America, Cuba sent soldiers and officers to promote violent guerrilla movements in countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Hundreds of Cuban military advisors still operate today in several Latin American countries.
Por eso, nuestro primer compromiso ha sido seguir defendiendo la posición de la Federación Rusa.
Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Cuba has been playing a crucial role for Russia in the diplomatic and disinformation fronts of the war.
Cuba have been involved since the very beginning in the diplomatic battlefield and in the propaganda battlefield. They have been crucial for the Russians not to get an overwhelming condemnation of African, Arab, and Latin American states at the United Nations and in other multilateral fora.
Russian top propagandist Vladimir Solovyov, in fact, urged on Russian national television back in September for the establishment of an international brigade of fighters from Cuba and other allied countries like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela to fight for Putin in Ukraine.
Они все время сколачивают международную коалицию. Почему мы отказываем себе в этом удовольствии? Есть прекрасно обученные нами отряды в Сирии. Есть люди, которые болеют за нас в Африке. Есть Венесуэла, есть Никарагуа, есть Куба.
In the last 18 months, Cuba and Russia have strengthened their alliance with a series of high-level meetings that leaves no doubt about Havana's support for Moscow. 9 months into the conflict, in last November, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel traveled to Moscow to personally express his support to Vladimir Putin. In March of this year, Putin's top security chief Nikolai Patrushev traveled to Cuba to meet Raul Castro and Díaz-Canel in what was described as a working visit whose details were kept in secret. In April, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov traveled to Havana as part of a tour for several Latin American countries. In May, Díaz-Canel declared Cuba's unconditional support for the Russian Federation in its confrontation with the West during the visit of Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Chernyshenko. In June, Cuban and Russian defense ministers met in Moscow to discuss joint technical military projects at the height of the Wagner mercenary mutiny. I propose to discuss in detail all the existing and promising cooperation projects in the military field, said Sergei Shoigu, Putin's Minister of Defense, in a meeting with Cuban Defense Minister Alvaro López Mira. The increasing participation of Cuba in the Russia-Ukraine conflict are already complicating relations with Washington. After the Cuban recruit scandal erupted, Raul Castro sent a special envoy for a meeting at the Department of State to discuss one of the critical issues for the Cuban dictatorship, its status as country sponsoring terrorism in the world. The Cuban regime has a long history of support for terrorism around the world, such as we have seen in this video, that has earned Cuba a rightful place in the U.S. government's list of state sponsors of terrorism.